So, thank you for coming, thank you for having me. My name is... Thank you, that's really nice. I'm really excited to be here actually. As a game studio, we quite often feel like we're on the outside of culture. So it's very exciting to be invited into what is a cultural event to talk about computer games. I've also never spoken in a town square before, so I feel like a politician, so that's very exciting for me. My talk is called Talking to the Dead, Exploration as Communication in Games. I actually made the title up a long time before I wrote the talk, so I think this title is totally wrong. So never mind, thank you for coming anyway. Let's see what I actually have to say. So, I work for Inkle, as perhaps you know, and we've been around about 13 years, and we have quite a diverse range of games in terms of play style. So, for the benefit of anyone who doesn't know who we are and what we do, Heaven's Vault down there is an adventure game, Pendragon is a tactics game, a Highland Song is a platformer, Overboard is a detective game, Forever Labyrinth is about finding connections in pieces of art, 80 Days is a text adventure. They're very diverse in terms of how the player interacts with the game. But the thing that they share is that they are all heart and soul narrative games. We talk about our games as machines for telling stories. That's the point, that's why we make them. So some of those stories are set in the real world, some of those are in fantastical and science fictional settings, but in general, they all want you to suspend your disbelief so that we can give you something beautiful and something true that you can take away with you, that will live inside you once the game is over. Now in this talk, I want to talk about 3 games in particular, so I'll very quickly introduce them in case you've never heard of me before or anything we've done. So the games are these 3. So first up is 80 Days. We released this in 2014. It's an adaptation of Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days in a kind of steampunk alternative 1872. So we have airships, and we have walking cities, and we have underwater trains, and things like that. The game itself spans the whole globe. We built cities in every continent, and the player can choose their route from city to city and visit places around the entire globe in the course of their adventure. And one thing we really wanted to do was tie the various inventions of each culture to the resources of the place where they were built. So we have mechanical camels in the desert. Obviously in the desert, there's no water, so they don't run on steam, they run on silicon in the sand instead. The main mechanic of the game is text with choices and choosing routes. So, fine. Next up, I want to talk a bit about a Highland Song, which is kind of like the opposite of 80 Days in some ways, in that it's not set in the past, it's set in 1990. It's in Scotland, so not the entire world, just one country. And at first, it appears quite realistic. So this shot on the left is actually basically a gameplay screenshot. We modeled some mountains down to every single rock and every single tree, and the player interacts by platforming. You climb and jump and scramble up and down mountainsides, that sort of thing. However, the more that you explore the hills, the more fantastical elements you'll come across. Firstly through stories and letters that you receive, and then meeting ghosts and people out of time, and even the odd mythological creatures. So by the end, the Scottish hills have become a kind of dreamlike environment. A crucible, which is just a fancy word for cup, holding centuries worth of remembered history through which the player is exploring. And then the third game kind of comes in the middle, which is Heaven's Vault, which is a straight up science fiction game. It's set in a place called the Nebula that I really love. It's a collection of scattered moons linked by flowing rivers through space, and the player explores them by sailing around in this tiny little wooden boat that you probably can't see, exploring and collecting fragments of a lost hieroglyphic language to decipher. So the core mechanic of the game is reading ancient hieroglyphic text. There's no historical reality here. It's not set in the real world at all, but instead we created a whole new history. So the timeline of the game world, which the player is uncovering as they play, stretches back 4,000 years, and it includes several large-scale political upheavals. And that's the story of the game is really the story of the Nebula. So, great. 3 worlds, 3 games. Now for us, these games are all about their narratives, but they're definitely narratives that are built on the worlds that they're set in, just as Zach was saying in his talk a moment ago. So we have steampunk 1872, we have Scotland, and we have outer space. But this isn't unusual, right? It's normal for games to focus on settings. As an industry, we build games from the world up. That's how we start. One of the core creative roles on any games team is the level designer, and their job is to lay out the physical space of the world that the player will explore as they play. It's a bit like setting up the table for a war game, or laying out the pieces for a chess problem. And the idea is that all the narrative and the mechanical elements of the game have got to slot into places in that world, or they simply will not happen. That's the deal. So, for example, when we were building a Highland song, these are some screenshots I just grabbed from our working folder. There on the left is the initial kind of block out that we did. So it's basic polygons to be rocks and surfaces that Moira can climb on. And then we'd play them and we'd mark up feedback, which would be this sort of thing. It would be, well, we need a thing here, or this event needs to go there, or this bit of landscape needs changing, or we need a shortcut from point to point, whatever. So we'd look at the map as a visual thing, and we'd place bits of extra activity or bits of interaction into that world. Because in a game, events aren't things that happen in time, they're things that happen in space. That's the fundamental way that games are built. And what that means is that level designers, who are fantastically talented people, and they are interested in things like architecture and visual art and urban planning, but the reality is, when you're a level designer, it's a lot less like making a building, which is used by lots of people in lots of different ways, or building a city like this one, which has hundreds of people going in all different directions. Being a level designer is a lot more like building an obstacle course or a playground, in the kind of things that the level designer is asking themselves are questions like, should we have two swings next to each other, or should we put something else in between them? Or if a kid falls off this climbing frame, how far back will they have to go in order to climb back to where they were? That's exactly a question that a level designer would ask, and it's also a question that a playground designer asks. So, the world of the game is laid out like a sort of computer program for the player to run through. So the level designer says, I have a jump, then a scramble, then a moment of confusion, then a glimpse of the exit, then a difficult climb to reach there, then a surprise drop, and so on. The gameplay elements are sequenced to create the story of the level, in the same way as a vinyl record player has a series of grooves and the needle runs across it, and that's what generates the music. In this case, the needle is the player running, falling, jumping, scrambling, and doing the stuff that you told the player to do. It's also, you could say, it's like the words in a sentence. We lay the words out, but when you read it, you skim through the words and you generate the meaning from the sentence. That's what you actually get from it. The action of you moving through time, across script, generates the flow of the level. And then when we're making a game, we do this last thing where we art it up. So this is a nice example of arting it up. So this is from Uncharted. I think it's Uncharted Lost Legacy, actually. So we have the designer block out. That's the level as is playable. And then we do this to it. We spend an enormous amount of money, an enormous amount of time doing that to it. And it looks staggering. It looks brilliant, doesn't it? It's beautiful. You put it on your box art, people say, oh my God, I can't believe the graphics in this game. And then when you come to play it, what does the player actually do? The player looks at this and goes, oh, that's nice. Now, where am I supposed to go? And what can I climb on and what can't I climb on? And, okay, all right, those trees, they aren't really trees, are they? They're just cylinders that I have to walk around. And the canopies, beautiful leafy canopies, they're just there to stop me being able to see what's over there. And this waterfall is amazing. Isn't it gorgeous? It's not even in the original block out, because actually that's just a section of rock that you can climb up. So effectively you can just walk up it. But it's a really clever use of water, because the waterfall in the background is where you're supposed to go next. And when you look at the screenshot, you can see it because it's a radically different color than the rest of the shot. So that water is effectively a whopping great big arrow that says, go this way. Genius. What a clever way to use your millions of dollars of art when you could have just painted an arrow on the floor. It does the same thing. It's kind of a strange thing that we do, but we do it habitually in the games industry. It's like all this art is kind of like the font in a book. Like if it's broken, then yeah, it will stop you reading the book. You can't read a book in Comic Sans. It's just not possible to do. But if the font works, it disappears. And the reader simply doesn't see it at all. You can only get art wrong. You can't really get it right. That's strange. And games suffer from this really, really badly, because not only is this true, we actively train players to ignore the art. We teach them to do it, and we want them to do it faster and faster. The skill of playing Uncharted is being able to look at that wonderful picture of a landscape and say, okay, that's the path, I go this way. Forget everything else. There's a lot of visual noise and clutter, but I, the player, the master of the universe, will remove all of that and focus on where I need to go and what I need to do next, and literally bin all the art as fast as possible. And the faster that I can do that, the better I am at the game. And the better I am at the game, the faster I can run through this level. And the faster I can run through this level, the faster the computer can unload the level, and we can literally throw it away. So we are training players to get good at a game so they can throw it away. So why did we build it in the first place? It's the weirdest thing. It's a bit like, I was thinking it's a bit like an illuminated manuscript, right? To use the writing metaphor again. Somebody wrote, I don't know, the Bible or something presumably important, and then they copied it onto this manuscript and they added these wonderful, ornate, charming, whimsical illustrations on every single page. They spent their whole lifetimes doing it, and then we come along, as modern people, and look at it and say, yeah, I can't read it. Don't know what it says. I mean, maybe you can because it's Latin and that might be close to Italian, but I certainly absolutely cannot read this. But I can look at the pictures, but they're not important. So, oops. It's not an accident that in the modern world with books, we don't do that anymore, we do this. And of course we do. We do black words on white paper because it's more efficient to make and more efficient to consume. It's just a better version of the same technology, right? If we want to get the text, this is a better way to do it. I feel sad about that too, but it is kind of true. And while nothing that extreme is happening in mainstream games at all, people love and value the art of games. They put them on the screenshots, they buy them for the screenshots, they share them on Twitter. Well, they don't anymore do that, who uses Twitter anymore, but they share them somewhere from the screenshots. We are still having to have this thought process as designers, right? Because of this damn thing. If you are thankfully far enough away from game culture that you don't know what that's a picture of, then well done, stay there. But the argument goes like this. We build the block out of the level that players can play and they enjoy. We add the wonderful art that makes it look incredible. We give it to players. They have no clue where they're supposed to go or what they're supposed to do. So we panic at the last minute and we cover all the climbable things in bright yellow paint so that you can see them. Do you remember the waterfall from earlier? That's a really clever version of this. This is a really not very clever version of this. But I'm not telling anyone off. They have to do this. We've tested it. If you give people the game without this stuff, they cannot play it. If you give it with this stuff, they complain that they bought a beautiful game and you've ruined it with yellow paint. You literally cannot win in this situation, which might suggest that we're doing the wrong thing, but whatever. At the heart of all this is a conflict that has kind of always been around in games, I think, between the gameplay and the fantasy, right? Is the world of the game there to provide us with a space to believe in, a space to be in? Or is it a functional thing designed just to be consumed by the player for the purpose of their mastery and their fun? Like, what is the game world for? But the truth is, this isn't really a conflict at all, because we all already know the answer, right? We know how we play games. It's not a secret. After a few hours of playing Assassin's Creed, every rooftop no longer is somebody's house. It's just a surface that you run on. After a few hours of playing Firewatch, every tree is just a cylinder that you have to go around again. As players, there's no question here. We immediately reduce the game world to its functional parts and then we play the game. That's what we do, it's what we've always done, and it's what we continue to do. Our friends come into the room and go, wow, that looks amazing. And we go, oh yeah, I suppose it does. Because our brains, we've switched that part of us off. The player is perennially this damn guy chomping his way through the stuff he's got to chomp through so he can get to the next level. The landscape doesn't stand a chance in this situation, right? It doesn't get to be a landscape for very long because it's really, we know, it's just a movie set. It's been designed to be looked at from a single point of view, which is always you, and experienced in a single way, and it pops into existence as you approach it, and when you leave it, it disappears, it's unloaded, it's disposable, it's forgettable. And if you replay a game, especially a linear adventure game, it becomes increasingly obvious how strictly defined those limits are, because there are parts of the world you simply cannot reach, and you cannot go to, and you never will be able to. It's just a channel that you're running in. Meanwhile, in this beautiful, wonderful, stunning world that we actually live in, a real landscape couldn't be more different. Here is a real landscape. Look at that. It just makes me feel calmer and happier immediately. Oh, isn't it lovely? I mean, it could be unreal, but it's not somehow. Why is that? Well, landscapes, whether they're cities like Trieste, or coastlines, or glaciers, or Mars, or whatever, they're not produced by a single design team for the benefit of a single moment in time. A landscape is, by definition, built continuously over its entire lifetime, which is usually measured in centuries, if not millennia. They never stop. Anytime you see a landscape, you're not seeing it, you're seeing a snapshot of it. It looked different 1,000 years ago. Where we're here right now looked very different 1,000 years ago, and it will look different 1,000 years from now. Landscapes are not created. They settle into place under the force of a million tiny actions, whether that's the individual building decisions and the planning arguments that take place over the history of a city, or it's the cascade of environmental forces that shape a natural location like that one. The sea beats the cliffs, the river carves the valley, the wind bends the trees, and so on. A landscape in the real world is the product of a chorus of influences and voices over a tremendously long period of time. And so it couldn't be further from the metaphor of a piece of writing that I mentioned earlier in the talk. That's not the right metaphor at all. The right metaphor is that a page of writing is like this very broken slide in my presentation. I'll talk through it. A page of writing is like a journey through a landscape. A single page of writing is like one trip across a landscape. And the landscape itself is basically like the writer of the page of writing. Not the page itself, but the person who created it. Let's see what the PowerPoint has for me. Okay, not bad. What is a writer? A writer is a person who can produce not one, but countless stories. And they're all different, but they're all unique to that person. And they vary based on the exact starting conditions that the writer happens to be in when they pick up their pen. So, how much money do they need to earn? What did they argue with their wife about that morning? What's in the news right now? What are they thinking about? What's recently been discovered in Silicon Valley? All of these things feed into the writer and come out as a piece of writing, as a journey through that writer's consciousness onto the page. And just as a landscape, one landscape can produce an infinite number of journeys depending on where you start from, what time of day it is, what's the weather like, how tired do you feel, where do you happen to look at. One landscape produces lots of journeys, one writer can produce lots of pieces of writing. And they're both just products of their experience, of the accumulated experience that formulated them. What are the experiences that made this writer the way they are? What damaged them? And what pressures made the landscape the way the landscape is? So that's great. As readers and players, that means we can't approach a landscape. It's too big. Same as we can't approach a writer directly and understand them. What we do is we travel. Travelers are people who explore a landscape. They go on a journey to learn about that landscape. And when you read a book, you go on a journey through the pages of the book to learn about that writer. You can't say, oh, I really know Ursula Le Guin because I've read one page of Earthsea, and a single holiday in the Scottish Highlands or a single day in Trieste is not, Trieste, sorry, I will get that right, is not enough to say, oh, I really understand this city now, I really get it, I'm totally here, man. But the more that you read and the more that you travel, the wider your understanding becomes, naturally, right? It's that thing that if there's a part of the world you really love, it's really tempting to reduce it to the paths you know and the landmarks you like. You say, oh, this is my favorite street and that's my favorite bar, as though you were making a map, as though you were turning this place you love into a piece of paper you could give to someone. But that's completely wrong. The more that you inhabit a place, place, the more you enjoy a place, the more you realize that the details are super important. The fantastic bar is less important than the feel of the city, and the wonderful view is less important than the atmosphere of the place you're standing in. And that's really hard to capture. It's hard to write down, and it's hard to give someone. It's something much more nebulous that you accrue through lots of journeys through a landscape. Okay, yeah, great, bruv. What about games? So, given all this, what is it to truly know a landscape? And can we ever actually do it in a game? Well, open world games super try, right? That is the whole appeal of the open world game, is that it will give you this wonderful experience of knowing a landscape. Broadly speaking, there are two kinds of open world. There is the crafted kind, and there is the procedural kind. In a crafted world, like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, or Breath of the Wild, or Elden Ring, there are no starting points, there are no fixed paths, you kind of make your own journey through the landscape, you come to understand it, this is great. But you are still a consumer. You harvest pickups, you kill enemies, you tick off areas of the map and you say, done, and then you leave them barren. It's just a space which has been finished. It has been mined dry. There's nothing left there. You're just crossing over it next time you go through it. In fact, you probably end up fast traveling, which has got to be antithetical to the idea of a landscape, right? Meanwhile, in a procedural game, you never attempt to see the whole world. It's obviously too big to see, so that's fine. And you kind of learn rules about it, right? Well, this planet's got a lot of hydrogen on it, but there's this danger, or this kind of metal ore appears if you dig to a certain depth, or if you need more wood, you go to the forest to collect it. So you learn these rules. So you kind of understand the world because you understand the rules, right? But it's still very reductive. It's still just mastery. Again, it positions the player as the only living thing in a dead world full of resources which must be removed. That's what the player in No Man's Sky is doing, is they're traveling to a wonderful outer space planet and then mining the living shit out of them. That's kind of tragic in a way. Our player is basically a vacuum cleaner. And it doesn't reflect the way that we travel in the real world at all. We don't go to places for their resources. I mean, maybe like mining companies and geologists go to places because they're excited about the resources in a certain place. But like most people are not miners or geologists. They don't even secretly want to be miners or geologists. There have been literally no movies about heroic geologists that I can think of. And there is only one movie about heroic miners, which is this one, and they don't do any mining in it. That's all we've got. So what can we do? Well, I said at the beginning that our games, and I'm not saying our games are like magic and solve this equation that no one else has solved, I just happen to know them well, okay? But in our games, we think of our games as machines for telling stories, and games are built from the world up. So that means, putting those ideas together, we want to make a world that tells stories, and preferably different stories every time you play. So that's about making your world feel big, and hopefully making it feel bigger than it really is, making it feel bigger by implication. So how do we do that? We have three basic techniques that we use across everything that we make, which are branching, implication, and derailment, which you might call distraction, essentially. They're kind of nebulous, so let me talk in concrete terms. In 80 days, you are traveling around the world from city to city, choosing 2 or 3 options to go to at each step. Where shall I go next? Where shall I go next? So we're branching the whole time. So the game world is much bigger than you can see on one run through. Great, okay, so it is big. The first thing is, it's a big world because it's big. Then when you reach a city, you explore it, which means going out, meeting someone who lives there, and talking to them about their lives. But it's only about half the time you actually get to do anything yourself. Most of the time, despite this being a game built around a choice mechanic, most of the time your only choice is how do you respond to this person who's come to tell you about what's going on in their life. So the only reward is a better understanding of the place you're in right now. Nothing material, nothing that particularly helps you, and nothing that can be fully consumed, ticked off, and finished. So firstly, we're implying a lot about the world because somebody comes in and tells you about something you'll never get to see, and we do that relentlessly all the time. So the world is bigger than what you see of it. But also, you can't win. So the story doesn't get used up. We find that players will go back to the game and replay a story they liked to see a different aspect of it. Because it's not finished, because they didn't go, yep, there was a baddie, I killed him, he's done. We don't give you that satisfaction of an ending. Finally, there are some stories, obviously, which you can pick up, which tease other stories, other places, and other cities you might want to visit. So we're constantly saying, okay, it would make sense for you to go here, but have you considered going there instead? Have you thought about going to the North Pole? That might be cool. And then people go, oh, okay. And so we derail you, we take you off your track to make the world feel bigger, because you're always thinking, what would have happened if I'd gone over there instead? In a Highland song, totally different game, as I said before, very specific, every single rock is an object in the world. And as a world to travel through in this direct way, we had to really watch out for that obstacle course effect. So it has a very, very open-ended approach to its level design. There are multiple start points to every level. There are multiple endpoints to every level. There's a huge number of hidden paths that you can find and unlock that will take you from one point of the level to another, basically to kind of mess around with you and mix you up as much as possible. And there's very, very little direction. We never really tell you where to go, ever. Players explore in this very haphazard way. So they'll fall off a cliff and then they'll find a cave mouth and they'll climb in and they'll come out somewhere else completely, miles from where they thought they were going. And so overall, it takes a lot of repeat plays, like a lot of repeat plays, to build up a coherent map of the hills, and there are always turnings and paths you didn't explore on every run, and so by implication, the world feels bigger than it really is. I know how big it is because I can see it in the editor, but we never let you see that. So we're branching, we're implying scope, and we're trying to distract you with these pickup maps that you find in the game that say, well, okay, fine, you're going to the lighthouse, that's your goal. Have you considered going to this hill over here for no reason except we gave you a piece of paper with a picture of it on? And if you don't, it'll sit there with a, you haven't done this mark for the entire game. And people hate that stuff. It's like the little, it's like the red one in a circle you got in your email account. Oh, I don't want to read this marketing email from an AI bullshit company, but I have to read it, because otherwise that number won't go away. And so this works great. So what are we trying to do? Basically, we're just chucking lots at you all the time. Because when people come to a computer game, they're in this kind of, I am the controller of my pocket calculator state of mind. They feel that they are in charge. They plan and execute. They are merciless. They are machines. They are robotic. They are the uber masculine object. And we have to break them, because we're in charge here, not them. That's how stories work. If you're running my story, it's not my story and I'm not interested. I'm running your story and you're going to shut up and listen. That's been true throughout the history of human storytelling. That's how theatre works. That's why Shakespearean plays have characters turn to the audience and go, shut up, I'm talking, literally in the dialogue. So we want a world where the player pushes at the world and the world pushes back. And that gives us a collaborative experience. And the player isn't in control. And better stories get told as a result of that, as a direct result of that. When people relate their adventures in 80 days, it's always like listening to someone going traveling when they're 19. They're like, I went to Paris and I met this guy, and then I went to Amsterdam, and then I don't even know what happened, but I woke up in Rome, and that was awful, oh my God. And then like this lovely kind of series of incidents, which is thoroughly unplanned and utterly delightful. And that's great, that's brilliant, that's a success. Those are journeys through the landscape of the world. We're not even the only people to have thought of this idea. There's a game, I haven't got a slide on this one. There's a game called The Outer Wilds, which is fantastic, which does exactly the same thing. People explore by setting off to one place, mess up the control of their spaceship, crash, find something else, and then always wonder what they might have been doing, and that works great. You get this sense of a much, much bigger space than it really is, because you can't see it properly, and you can't pick bits off it one by one, like chipping away at that bloody cube Peter Molyneux made 15 years ago. So we move the player from being a consumer of the features of the landscape to a co-creator of the landscape itself. They are both discovering the stories attached to the places in our level design process and creating stories of their own. Right, this isn't a new idea. I came across this in a book that was super popular in the 1980s called The Songlines by a guy called Bruce Chatwin, which describes, amongst other things, the way that Australian Aborigines navigated the enormous Australian interior without the use of any pictorial maps. So Aborigines historically just didn't use visual maps at all. And I should say that Chapman was a travel writer, not an ethnographer or an anthropologist, and I'm not sure that anthropologists treat his book with a huge amount of respect, actually, and I'm not sure that his book isn't quite patronising and quite possibly racist as well. These are unfortunate things, but it's describing a really brilliant idea. The idea might not be true. It may have nothing to do with the reality of Aborigines. I can't check that. But the idea is wonderful, and the idea that he says that these people have used for thousands and thousands of years is that they carry journeys in songs. So as they walk, they sing a song to keep themselves going and to keep their pace. And the lyrics of the song, the words of the song, include the directions which tell them where to go on the journey that they're taking, a journey which might be hundreds, if not thousands of miles. So the song will talk about, this is the tree where the ancestor sheltered, and they'll find that tree, and that's when they turn left, because that's what the ancestor does in the song. They'll find the watering hole where he drank, and so on and so forth. He goes so far as to suggest that the pattern of the music describes the terrain itself, so long, flat notes for salt plains and jaggedy things for rocks. That seems outlandish to me, but again, I can't check it. But what a great idea. Songs are really memorable. Songs are easy to communicate. The father walks with the daughter and teaches the song to her as they go. And then when she walks the same route, she knows the song which tells her the way. That sounds like a thing that human beings would do. Whether or not it's actually true, I can't say. But this idea of using events to mark places is really interesting. And actually we saw it again when we were researching Pitcairn Island for 80 days. The history of Pitcairn Island is absolutely horrible. It was an empty place in the Pacific Ocean, it was tiny, that was settled by mutineers who were thrown off the ship, the Bounty, in 1790. This is a map of the place. Obviously you can't read the place names because they're tiny, but there's one place on this island is a cliff called Where Dick Fall, which is named presumably after a place where, once upon a time, a man called Dick got too close to the edge of the island and fell off it. This must have happened quite a lot, because there's also where Freddie Fall, Robert Fall, Johnny Fall, Lynn Fall, Dan Fall, Martin Larsou Fall, Nelly Fall. There's one place which is simply called Oh Dear. This is 100% true. And more happily, perhaps, there is a bay which is called John Catch a Cow. Quite how he caught a cow in the Pacific Ocean, I'm not at all sure. But this is true. Because the way that we understand places is not through their resources and not through their obstacles and their climbing challenges. It's through the stories of the things that happened in those places. I looked up, for instance, where the name Trieste comes from, and it's from a Roman city that was here originally called Tergeste, which comes from the Veneti word for market, Veneti is a language which is long lost, but it was around in about the 10th century BCE. So the market no longer exists. Well, I suppose this is a shopping centre, but the story of it survives in the name that we use. My hometown is Cambridge, which is named after a bridge over a cam, and a cam is a sharp elbow bend in a river. The bend in the river no longer exists because when the university was built, they got rid of it. They straightened the river and turned it into what is effectively a canal. But the name continues to tell the story of this time when people found a river and it did something interesting, and they went, ooh, that's nice. Names and stories give meaning to landscape by creating these additional journeys that we can take through the landscape without the need to actually do the walk for ourselves. And so when we give that to players, we make our players into seekers of lost stories. And we have a word for that. We have a word for the seeker of a lost story, which is an archaeologist. And it turns out people secretly do want to be archaeologists. And there are loads of movies about heroic archaeologists, which is kind of interesting because, like, an archaeologist isn't enormously different from a geologist, right? I said earlier that no one wants to be a geologist, right? That everyone wants to be an archaeologist. But they are both basically concerned with stuff buried under the ground, aren't they? In stories, they're both looking for deposits of gold. It's just that the geologist is interested in the chemical process that put the gold in the ground, and the archaeologist is interested in the human process that put the gold in the ground. Archaeologists don't dig for minerals, they dig for stories. And that's why we think they're cool, because actually we don't really care about anything apart from stories and other human beings. That's how we work, right? So we did this really explicitly when we built Heaven's Vault. So this is a level of Heaven's Vault, and the player approaches this ruined building, which, you know, hopefully looks cool and will provide some exploration challenges. And the protagonist, who is an archaeologist, this lady in the middle called Aliyah Al-Azra, will speculate. She'll talk and say, oh, this is what I think this building is and what it was for. So approaching the gate, she'll say, oh, maybe this was a farm. But then she'll find out that the ground is sort of all dusty and deserty, and she'll say, okay, all right, no, probably not a farm. Maybe it was a manor house instead. But then inside, the fittings are quite poor. It's not fancy, there's no fancy stuff. So she'll say, okay, maybe that doesn't make sense. It can't be a manor house. So maybe it's just a house, just an isolated house. And then behind the house, she'll find a shrine with a religious symbol. So she says, oh, okay, this is some kind of monastery, and so on and so forth. And as she digs around, she'll find these little inscriptions in our ancient language, and the player gets to solve the puzzle of what it says, and that will give us more clues. So she might find an inscription mentioning illness and say, oh, right, okay, this must be a hospital. But the deductions she's making are always speculative. There's nothing in the game that will confirm a theory, only things which will disprove a theory, just as real archaeologists. They don't know if they're right. No one ever comes up from the dead and says, you are right, this was a market town in the 10th century. They can only prove that it wasn't. And the player is making choices all the time about which theories they believe in, as Aliyah offers them. So we're actively involved as players. The purpose of this is not the lore. We are not here to collect the lore of the world, like we were just making a little booklet. Most of what's discovered archaeologically as you play Heaven's Vault has absolutely no bearing on the main story of where the player will go next at all. It's more so that the players have an understanding of how their journey through the Nebula fits into the wider past of the Nebula and how those two things riff off each other. Some players absolutely do not get this at all. They play the game and they say, this is totally pointless. It literally doesn't matter what translations I choose here. I could say anything, it doesn't change the result. Look, click, 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 nothing changes. That's fair enough, they're not wrong. If these people are determined to live in a world of cold abstractions, they're happy to. If they want to live in a freezer, they could live in a freezer. That's fine by me. But for other players, you know, normal people, I think this process of understanding the game in cautious, ambiguous, sort of emotional steps gives us this result that the place becomes lived in, it becomes real. It's no longer a resource farm to be stripped of its artifacts, or a puzzle to be completed, ticked off, and forgotten about. There is a finite number of inscriptions to find in any level, of course there is, but when you've got them all, what's left behind isn't empty. It's now richer because you understand it better. Each level transforms into an imaginative play space that existed before the start of the game and will continue to exist after the game is over. It hasn't been set up for our benefit. We haven't signposted you round it so that you can understand it quickly and move on. Instead, what we've hopefully done is load it into your mind as a graphical asset, as an imaginative asset, and now that it's there, you can test your theories on it. You can apply stories to it. You can reevaluate it as your understanding changes. You can have little moments of revelation about how something might have been. Hopefully, after all of this, the player is no longer in communication with us, the level designers and the writers and the artists. We're not actually interesting here. Hopefully the player is not thinking, oh, I love the way they put that slide next to that climbing frame. That was really cool. Because I don't care about that, and I don't want them to care about that. Hopefully, the player is now in communication quite directly with the person who made the house. Because that's who I want the player to be talking to, this fictional person who never existed and never will exist, but is more real in the moment of the game than I am, ideally. As a game team, we are a mere font. We are not Comic Sans, and we disappear, and the meaning remains. I don't even think this is unusual. I think this holds true outside of games as well. The very best fantasy and sci-fi spaces are those that feel larger than the boundaries of the story that they happen to be in today. So the way that Star Wars drops planets and historical events that never needed to be seen on screen ever, that were better left as references, is exactly the same way that in the Sherlock Holmes stories of Conan Doyle, Dr. Watson constantly references other cases that Holmes has solved that he just hasn't written about. A technique that was so effective that people were always a little bit unsure as to whether maybe Sherlock Holmes was actually real. It was easier for people to think, maybe Holmes is a real person, than to think that the writer has mentioned a case that he never wrote. Because that's a weird thing for a writer to do. What a brilliant use of implication right there in the 1900s. We kind of tested this sort of cross-media thing a little bit ourselves. A few years ago, we novelized Heaven's Vault, right? So I took the game with its interactive elements and turned it into a book in an attempt to try and capture that sense of a large, open, diverse, imaginative space within a completely fixed linear narrative. I think it came out well, but I'm not really the judge of it. Which all brings me back to illuminated manuscripts. Because when we look at this page here, what we're really looking at is not a text with some annoying extra pictures around it that clutter the page. What we're looking at is a central core text of something important, surrounded by the skill and the whimsy of an extremely talented artist from 600 years ago who spent their whole life keeping books alive and filling them with new ideas and new thoughts and doodles and images and surprises and jokes and reflections and what they happen to be thinking about that morning. And in a beautiful twist of fate, that artist, that human, wins in the long run. Because when we look at these pages now, none of us, well, certainly not me, can read the words. I have no idea what the core text is or even where it comes from. But the images, I can still understand. I can still enjoy the lady with the knife in her mouth, or the little dragon thing and the dude sitting on top of it. I love the fighting rabbits. Everyone's seen the fighting rabbits illuminating manuscript, right? The artist has won, not the text, not the obstacle course. Everything around it, the imaginative play space, is what has actually survived, because it's much more human than the text that they were faithfully copying in a machine-like way. So I think we need to be creating game spaces that feel like this, and this is what we try to do at Inkle. That's what I want to keep doing. They have their functional core. The game has got to be playable, but that really isn't enough. The space around that core should be playful. It should be expressive. It should be meaningful. It can't just be beautiful or look cool or expensive. It has to tell us something, so that we can tell the story of our journey through it and the stories of the journeys of others, while knowing that there are more journeys that could have been made through that space, and there are more journeys than we will ever see, because that's when a fictional place comes alive. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. Very inspiring. And are there any questions about? I mean, the talk was essentially about how to tell stories that are not only playful but also interactive through space, no? Which is a sort of major topic of everyone who's interested in game design or in interactive storytelling in general. Any question? There's one there. Okay.
You talked about branching paths in your games, and this is also from, you also wrote sorcery, right? Yeah. And what I was wondering, how do you deal with not getting overwhelmed as a writer? Because branching paths gets exponentially bigger, right? For every path there is always another branch and so on and so on. So.
Right, so the question is, how do I stop myself from getting overwhelmed by how branchy the story gets, by all the choices that the player makes?
Yeah, and also not having conflict.
Yeah, so there are two things. The first thing is, when you're branching, it's a really good idea to have a sense of the different scales that you're working on, right? So take this talk, for example, right? I had a choice when I came to sit here. I could have done a good talk, I hope I did. I could have done a terrible talk. I could have tripped over and just fallen asleep on the stage. Those were kind of my choices, roughly. At the end of the day, that would have affected the outcome of your experience here. But then I would have walked out the door, and it might have had a consequence, but it probably wouldn't have had a huge consequence, actually. Like, it wouldn't be dogging my steps. I wouldn't go radically different based on that. So the micro choice of the moment doesn't necessarily affect the wider choice of the story. Maybe it just colours it a little bit, but it doesn't necessarily push you onto a completely different path. So you don't have to make every choice have a huge long-term significance for it to feel extremely meaningful in the moment. I'm very glad I didn't fall asleep on the stage, for example. That's the first thing. The second thing is, as a writer, as I've probably communicated, I absolutely do not want any player to be able to look at one of my games and understand the full scope of it, the full map of it. I feel like if I've done that, I've failed. Because there are players who are actively trying to reduce a game down to its wiring, strip it down to its core, and I refuse to let you do that. I'm in a struggle with that player the whole time. And the way that I do that is I think, well, if I can hold a full map of the story in my head, then it's possible that you can. So I have to make sure that this story is more complicated than I can hold in my head. Because I'm pretty familiar with it, I'm pretty intimately familiar with it. So long as I can overwhelm myself with the amount of choices and branching that it has, then it's likely that I can also overwhelm you. So the way that we do that is we build a core spine of the game, and then we just keep throwing stuff at it. And every time I think, oh, I really understand this scene, I understand how it starts and ends, there's no flexibility in it, I think, right, time to mess that up, time to chuck some stuff in, time to derail that, time to do something with that messes up this section. And the more that you do that, it's a bit like making an oil painting or something. You start with broad strokes, and you layer and you layer and you layer, and you step back and you go, holy crap, I'm Vermeer, that's amazing, how's that happened? And like, well, the slow way. It's the way that it happens. So, yeah, I think one of the things that I've always enjoyed is I'm just not afraid of branching. I mean, maybe I should be. Our games can be quite buggy at times, but like, I love it. It's so fun. So yeah, definitely that is a feature, not a bug.
Okay, there are other questions? Or
Yes.
one there?
Hello, thank you for your presentation and for Heaven's Vault, which is one of my favorite games ever. So it's been great to have you here and listen to your presentation. And it was more an observation, which was really interesting when you said that staying a day in a place doesn't explain you the full place, reading a page or writing doesn't. And it's interesting because it was also an observation that came out with queer games, like the first queer games. Dysphoria comes to mind from Anthropy, which is the story of the transition of a transgender woman. And one thing she was pretty adamant about is that you can't understand the experience of a transgender woman just because you played a game of mind which lasts like 10 minutes. And there's also like a whole movement in queer game studies against that point of view, that saying like empathy games, so-called empathy games, can make you understand the whole story. So it's like, it was really interesting to see this connection from the queer game communities. So it's also interesting because in that case it's almost dangerous to think you can understand something so complex, so great, just for a short experience can lead you to false beliefs, to false understanding. So yeah, it was just this observation that came to mind.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So I think there's a real danger with computers, and I think this is, I think we see this all the time, that they make us feel like gods. They make us feel like we have this incredible amount of power and information at our fingertips, that we can know everything. We just Google it. My son's 8. He's like, I say, I don't know what this is. And he's like, well, Google it. Google will be able to tell you. Like, you say, is this pizza gluten-free? And go Google it. Google's not going to know that. But he has this idea, which I think we all have, that as soon as you have a computer, you are unstoppable. You are a god. You're a monolith. You're going to take over the world. And understanding has never been like that, and it never will be like that. And this idea that someone can give you something, like whether that's an empathy game to help you understand what it's like to have a child dying of cancer, it might open a door for you, but obviously you're not going to understand it. Or whether that's a TikTok video that claims to help you understand ADHD in 35 seconds, like, that's not going to work. And the danger is not people giving you information. That's great, and giving you experiences, that's fantastic. The danger is us going, I have absorbed one piece of information, therefore I am untouchable, which we all habitually do, and we do it with computers, and you see it all the time. So I think one thing that I'm very adamant about is not just the idea that we need to be kind of more open about what we don't know, but pushing for contradiction and ambiguity within the context of computer games specifically, right? When I'm writing a computer game, I want to be making you fight a contradiction in the narrative. I want to give you two things which cannot be true at the same time, which you have to reconcile. I want that friction inside the head of the player, because otherwise they go, I have accumulated the perfect history of this computer game, I am done. I want people to go, this doesn't work, that doesn't fit with that. And like, I have been known to deliberately include contradictions in the backstory of a game precisely so it cannot be solved. I won't tell you which games and I won't tell you where they are. But like, it's a great strategy just for keeping the thing alive and keeping us thinking. Because if we're not thinking, what the hell are we doing? So yeah, I totally agree.
Okay, other questions? We have time for another one, a last one maybe? Yes?
This is maybe more from Stefano than from me as a question, but because it's something we discussed together some months ago. At the end of the day, when I go and look for a Highland song guide on the internet, I can find probably I can already find all the possible paths in the games. So yes, it was. You can try to obscure, to be most obscure the possible path, the size of the world, the scale of the world, but at the end of the day, it's a representation, a digital representation of the physical world. And I completely agree with you that the physical world is not reducible to this kind of digital representation, but then what you are making is a digital representation. Digital representation is limited. It's always be so. There is not a kind of conflict between the idea of trying to represent the obscurity of the world when you already know that the thing you are actually using is limited, and at the same time, because you're saying, okay, I'm trying to represent this kind of obscurity. At the same time, I wanted to stress that the computational representation of the world will always be limited, but I'm using it to represent obscurity. So there's not kind of a conflict here.
So I think that's just what art is, isn't it? Like, in every media, we know that we're limited by the constraints of it. A book is never going to represent, I don't know, Ireland in the pre-war, like a year before the Second World War, but it might capture a sense of it in a way that opens a door or brings people to a new understanding. It's always going to hit its limitations. It has to. It's a finite object in a way that a landscape isn't. But isn't that fun? Isn't that exciting? How much further we can push what art can make than we think we can. I think one thing that you see in computer games is people saying, well, a level design works like this. This is the level. You play the level. You finish the level. That's how games work. And I think what we're saying is, you think the boundary is here in terms of how open-ended your level can be. The boundary is over here. You just need to do a whole bunch of other stuff and think about the way that the player experiences it. And you're right, there is still a boundary. There is still possible to map the entirety of a Highland song. It must be possible because we built it. But that doesn't mean to say that for the average casual player who comes into it, they're seeing a much further horizon than they might otherwise have seen if we hadn't have done that work. And so I think the work is important. But yeah, I don't believe we'll ever solve the problem of representing a landscape, for example, in a game. But I don't want to solve that problem. I don't want you to sit at a computer and explore Scotland in a computer game. Enjoy our game by all means. It's a great game and it's on Steam and it's on sale next week. But also, go to Scotland. It's awesome. Like, travel, see the actual world, because it's precious and it's right there and it's beautiful. So, like, I think art should invite us back into reality, not try to bottle reality so that I can sell it to you. That's unhealthy. So, yeah, I think that tension is real, I think it exists, and I think it's valuable, actually. Yeah.
Okay, this was not planned, but of course it's a huge comeback on the fact that we as EV Pro Italian video game program are aiming at using digital games to discover the actual world and the actual world heritage, so it's perfectly as planned. Okay, our time is over, so thank you again, Jon.